It had been a long week for Lily. She had recently moved into the quiet, aging apartment building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable, and the building's central location made it ideal for someone just starting over. The neighbors were quiet, as was the building itself. A perfect place for her to escape the noise of her former life and start fresh. At least, that's what she had told herself. Her apartment was small but cozy, with hardwood floors and high ceilings. It had character, which was more than she could say for her last place. The walls were thick, muffling most sounds from the other apartments, making it feel like she was living in her own little world. That peace, however, was shattered the moment she noticed the woman across the hall. The woman lived in apartment 3B, directly opposite Lily's unit. At first, Lily barely took notice of her, though she'd seen her come and go a few times, always hurried, always with her head down. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she wore a set of oversized glasses that made her look older than she likely was. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Lily started to get a sense that something was off. The first strange occurrence happened late one night. Lily had just finished her late-night shift at the diner and was about to climb into bed when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, methodical, as though someone was walking in a trance. She froze, listening. There was something eerie about the way they echoed through the halls, each step feeling deliberate, like they were approaching her door. Curiosity tugged at her. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Just the emptiness of the hallway. Her heartbeat quickened, and she told herself she was being paranoid. After all, it was just an old building with thin walls. She turned away, trying to shake the strange feeling that had crept into her chest. The next morning, she noticed the woman from 3B again. This time, she was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at Lily's door. Lily froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. But before she could even wave or say hello, the woman turned and vanished into her apartment without a word. It wasn't a long interaction, but something about it sent a shiver down Lily's spine. The way the woman looked at her, cold, almost predatory, left her feeling unsettled. She brushed it off as her imagination running wild. But as the days went on, Lily began to notice more strange things happening in the building. It started with the whispers. At night, when Lily lay in bed, she could hear faint voices coming through the walls, drifting in from the apartment next door. At first, she assumed it was just her neighbor in 3B talking on the phone, but as the whispers continued, they began to sound wrong. The voices were distorted, like a conversation from the other side of a wall made of heavy, wet stone. Lily lay still in the dark, straining to make sense of the noise. It wasn't like the regular sounds of a person talking. The voices didn't sound human. They were distorted, low and guttural, as if they were being spoken from deep within the earth itself. The whispers grew louder, and Lily couldn't ignore them any longer. One night she stood up and crept over to the wall, pressing her ear against it, praying it would stop. But it didn't. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the voices knew she was listening. She quickly pulled away, a chill crawling down her spine. The next morning, when Lily ran into her neighbor in the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The woman from 3B didn't acknowledge her at all, not even with a glance. She simply walked past Lily with a purpose, her eyes vacant, as if she were in a world of her own. Lily's gaze lingered on the door to apartment 3B as the woman disappeared into her unit. As the days went on, Lily started to feel like she was being watched. Every time she passed 3B, the woman was either in her apartment or nowhere to be found. But Lily couldn't shake the sensation that she was being observed from behind those walls. Then one evening, Lily saw the woman standing in the hallway again, but this time her behavior was far more unsettling. She wasn't walking or going anywhere. She was standing still, facing the wall in front of Lily's door, unmoving, staring with an intensity that made Lily's blood run cold. The woman's mouth was slightly open, as though she were murmuring something inaudible, but her eyes were locked onto the spot where Lily stood. Lily didn't know what to do. She stood frozen for a few moments, unsure if she should approach the woman or turn and flee into her apartment. But before she could make a decision, the woman turned sharply and disappeared into her apartment, her movements quick and jerky, like a puppet with broken strings. The odd behavior continued, and Lily couldn't escape the feeling that she was being drawn into something she didn't understand. She didn't know what it was, but her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. The whispers became more frequent, and Lily began to notice strange things happening in her own apartment. Objects out of place, lights flickering on and off, the temperature dropping suddenly in the middle of the night. Lily's dreams were the worst part. Every night she was plagued with vivid nightmares of being trapped in a dark, claustrophobic space. The shadows around her would twist and writhe like living things, closing in on her until she couldn't breathe. In the middle of one of these nightmares, she woke up to find her bedroom window wide open, despite having locked it earlier in the night. Terrified, she bolted from her bed and rushed into the hallway, where she saw the woman standing in front of her door, once again staring at it, her eyes empty and unblinking. Lily tried to speak, but no words came out. She couldn't move, frozen by the fear that gripped her chest. The woman didn't seem to notice her presence. She just stood there, murmuring something that sounded like a chant. Then, without warning, the woman turned and walked into Lily's apartment. Lily followed in a daze, her heart racing, unsure if she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. The moment Lily entered her apartment, the door slammed shut behind her, locking them both inside. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving her in a suffocating darkness. She tried to scream, but the woman's hands shot out and clamped over her mouth, silencing her. The woman leaned close, her breath cold against Lily's ear. "They've been watching you, Lily. It's too late now. You're part of it. You're part of all of it." Before Lily could react, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and warp, swirling like smoke around them. The temperature plummeted and the air grew thick, choking her as if the very walls were closing in on her. The woman released Lily, stepping back into the darkness with a twisted smile. "I'm not your enemy, Lily. I've been waiting for you. We all have." The darkness receded just enough for Lily to see her surroundings. The apartment looked different somehow. The walls were now covered with old, yellowed photographs. Photos of people she didn't recognize, all standing in front of the same building. The woman was in the center of each one, her eyes staring blankly at the camera. "I don't understand," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "What is this? What do you want from me?" "You've always been a part of this, Lily," the woman said, her voice cold and distant. "The building, this place, it chooses its own. And now, it's chosen you." Lily's heart sank as the truth began to sink in. The building wasn't just a place, it was alive, feeding on the energy of those who lived within it. The woman in 3B wasn't a neighbor, she was a guardian, and now it was Lily's turn to take her place. Lily tried to flee, but the shadows twisted around her, pulling her back toward the center of the room. She cried out, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers, growing louder and louder in her ears. They surrounded her, suffocating her, their voices filled with rage and hunger. "You can't leave, Lily," the woman's voice echoed through the darkness. "You belong here now. You're one of us." In that moment, Lily realized the truth. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. The building had claimed them all one by one, turning them into something else, something twisted and hungry. She was part of it now, and there was no escaping. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and Lily felt her body shift, her mind fragmenting as she was consumed by the darkness, swallowed whole by the building that would never let her go. Months passed, and the building remained the same, quiet, unassuming. But those who lived in it would never be the same again. The woman from 3B had found her next successor, and Lily was waiting for the next soul to enter. Cynthia had always been the type to keep to herself. Moving into the old duplex on the edge of town had been a decision made for peace and quiet, far from the chaos of the city. The building, though aged, seemed well kept, and the price was right for a single woman looking for some solitude. Her downstairs neighbor, Mr. Rowe, was an older gentleman with a quiet demeanor. He never made much noise, and they exchanged pleasantries in the hallway, but nothing more. Cynthia appreciated the distance, and life settled into a predictable routine. But something was wrong. It started with the sounds. At first, Cynthia thought it was the old pipes in the building, creaking in the night. But as the days passed, the sounds became more specific. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They always seemed to come from below, in the basement, just beneath her apartment. At first, she ignored it, chalking it up to old house quirks. But the footsteps didn't stop. They started every night at exactly midnight, a slow and methodical thumping against the floorboards, like someone walking with great care, as if they were trying to avoid being heard. Cynthia was curious but afraid at the same time. She didn't know much about Mr. Rowe's past, and she hadn't seen him leave his apartment in days. The sounds continued every night, and the tension in her apartment grew unbearable. One evening, she decided to investigate. The basement door was just down the hallway, a narrow, creaky wooden door with a rusty handle. She stood in front of it for what felt like an eternity, wondering if she should even go down there. But something inside her pushed her to do it. An instinct, perhaps. Taking a deep breath, Cynthia turned the handle and slowly creaked the door open. The air that hit her face was musty, stale, and filled with the smell of dampness. The basement steps were steep and dark, but she could see a faint light from below. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. She had almost reached the bottom when the sound stopped abruptly. Silence. Cynthia hesitated, standing frozen for a moment. Her eyes tried to adjust to the darkness of the basement, and that's when she saw him. Mr. Rowe. He was standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. His back was to her, but the way he stood, rigid, unmoving, made her feel like he wasn't entirely human. A chill ran down her spine, but before she could react, Mr. Rowe slowly turned around, his eyes wide, unblinking, and eerily blank. He smiled at her, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Cynthia," he said, his voice low and raspy. "What are you doing here?" Cynthia was paralyzed, unsure how to respond. There was something in his gaze, something unsettling that made her blood run cold. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. I heard the footsteps," she stammered. "I thought you might be in trouble." Mr. Rowe's smile faded, replaced with a strange, hollow expression. No trouble, just working, don't worry about me." But Cynthia's gaze fell to the floor, and she saw something she wasn't prepared for. Blood. A trail of it, leading toward Mr. Rowe's feet. The sight sent a jolt of panic through her, and she stumbled backward, but Mr. Rowe remained motionless. His eyes never left hers. What's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mr. Rowe finally spoke again, but his words were far more chilling than she could have imagined. "I've been here a long time, Cynthia. You're not the first to come down here." Cynthia was in shock, unable to move as Mr. Rowe stepped closer. The blood was still visible, smeared across the concrete floor. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. The room seemed to shrink around her, and the basement, once an ordinary place, now felt like a tomb. "I didn't want you to know," Mr. Rowe said, his voice trembling, "but you've seen too much now." He stepped closer to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to grow taller with each step, as if something within him had shifted. Cynthia tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the air itself had become thick and sticky, trapping her in place. "You're not what you seem," Cynthia managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Rowe's smile returned, but it was twisted, distorted, like something wrong beneath the surface. "No, I'm not," he agreed, his voice dark and unnatural. "But I'm not the only one. This place, this house, it has a history. You don't understand. It's in the bones of this place." Cynthia's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. She glanced around the room, at the concrete walls that seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. The smell of decay filled her nostrils, and for a moment, she felt dizzy, like she might pass out. "You're just like them," Mr. Rowe continued, his voice low. "You've been drawn in, just like all the others who've lived here." Cynthia's heart pounded in her chest, the realization hitting her like a slap to the face. She had thought that she was just an ordinary tenant in an ordinary apartment, but now, everything felt different. The whispers that had been in the walls, the footsteps that echoed through the floor, they weren't random. They were part of something much darker. "I had to do what I did," Mr. Rowe muttered, almost to himself. They wanted out. They all wanted out, but they didn't understand. They were just ghosts. They couldn't leave. They still can't. Cynthia's mind was spinning. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Who wanted out?" The basement seemed to close in on her as Mr. Rowe stepped closer, his movements becoming erratic. His hands twitched at his sides and his voice grew louder, more desperate. "They're still down here. They never left. They live in the walls, in the floors. And now you'll be one of them." Cynthia didn't know how to react. Her brain couldn't process the things Mr. Rowe was saying. She didn't want to believe him, but deep down, she knew he wasn't lying. There was something wrong with the house, something ancient and twisted, and she had stumbled into its dark heart. Mr. Rowe's expression twisted into a grimace, his eyes wild. "You don't get it, do you? You've already made the choice. The house chose you. I didn't want this for you, but it's too late now." "Too late?" Cynthia repeated, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about? I never asked for this." "You didn't have to," Mr. Rowe snapped. "You've been living here, haven't you? Didn't you feel it? The way the walls breathe? The way the house calls to you? You're part of it now. The house doesn't let go." Suddenly, Cynthia felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. It wasn't just the fear of Mr. Rowe or the blood on the floor. It was something deeper, something primal. She realized too late that she had become a part of the house's history. She turned to run, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening thud. Cynthia screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. She turned back to Mr. Rowe, who was now standing in front of her, blocking her escape. "You can't leave," he whispered. "None of us can." The walls groaned as though they were alive, the air heavy with a suffocating darkness. Cynthia could hear whispers, soft at first, but then they grew louder, like a chorus of voices chanting her name. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. A shadow seemed to emerge from the walls, tall, looming, its shape indistinct, but its presence suffocating. Cynthia felt an icy grip on her heart as the shadow reached out toward her. Cynthia stood frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. She had heard the stories, the rumors about the old house, about the people who had lived here before her, but never, in her wildest imagination, had she thought she would be standing in the middle of a nightmare. Mr. Rowe's voice broke through her panic. "You have a choice, Cynthia. You can join us. You can be part of the house, part of the history. Or..." His voice trailed off, and Cynthia looked at him, her heart racing. "Or what? Or you can fight. You can leave. But you'll never be free. Not really." Cynthia's mind spun, torn between the two paths. She had no idea what would happen if she joined them. But something in her, something deep inside her, knew that the house would never let her go. With a burst of strength, she pushed past Mr. Rowe and ran toward the door, desperate to escape. The whispers in the walls grew louder, the shadow growing closer. But just as her fingers brushed the door handle, a cold hand gripped her shoulder. She turned around and Mr. Rowe was right behind her, his face contorted into a hideous grin. "You're already ours," he said. The basement door burst open, and the shadows swallowed her whole. Jack Thompson had never paid much attention to his neighbors before. The quiet street where he lived was filled with retired couples and families whose lives buzzed with a routine predictability. That changed the day Mr. Whitaker moved into the house at the corner. The man was old, with a hunched frame and eyes that seemed too keen for someone his age. He rarely left the house, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was always being watched. The first time Jack noticed it, he brushed it off as paranoia. He'd been typing away at his latest manuscript when he glanced out the window and saw Mr. Whitaker staring back from behind his lace curtains. The figure's silhouette stood perfectly still, as if frozen in place. Jack's fingers paused over the keyboard, a strange prickle of discomfort trickling down his spine. He turned away, forcing himself to focus on his work. Over the next few days, the glances became more frequent. Every time Jack's eyes drifted to the window, there was Mr. Whitaker, observing him with a relentless stare. It became a game Jack didn't want to play, a battle of nerves where the stakes felt higher than he was willing to admit. The air grew thick with unease, an invisible thread connecting their homes. When night fell, the silence of the neighborhood seemed louder. Whispers of branches brushing against the roof or the distant wail of an ambulance would echo into Jack's mind, only to be joined by the haunting thought of those watchful eyes. He tried to ignore it, told himself he was imagining things. Yet, the feeling lingered, sinking its claws into his routine. One evening, the stare became more than just a distant threat. That night, as the rain drummed against the window panes, Jack sat in his living room with a mug of coffee, its warmth failing to soothe his nerves. The television droned in the background, but he wasn't watching. His attention was focused on the window and the house across the street, which loomed in darkness. Mr. Whitaker's curtains fluttered slightly, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a face pale and ghostly, illuminated by a flicker of lightning. He blinked, but the face was gone. The rain had become a torrential downpour, and the wind howled through the trees. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the house. It was sharp, urgent, and rattled the door on its hinges. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. He stood up, every muscle tensed. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. With shaky hands, Jack approached the door and peered through the peephole. Darkness. He flipped on the porch light, but it sputtered and died almost instantly. The rain blurred the outside world into a chaotic swirl of black and gray. Just as he was about to turn away, a third knock sounded, softer this time, almost like a tap. Summoning his courage, Jack unlocked the door and cracked it open. Cold wind and rain lashed his face as he scanned the empty porch. There was nothing but shadows dancing in the storm. He was about to shut the door when a flash of movement caught his eye. A figure stood at the edge of his driveway, unmoving. The wind died down just enough for Jack to hear a voice, low and hoarse. "Come outside, Jack." It was Mr. Whitaker, his silhouette stark against the dark street. Jack's breath caught in his chest as he stared at the figure. Mr. Whitaker stood with a strange stillness, rain streaming down his gaunt face. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to lock onto Jack's soul, pulling him into a silent challenge. Every instinct in Jack's body screamed at him to slam the door and bolt it shut, but he felt rooted to the spot. "Come outside," Mr. Whitaker repeated, his voice somehow cutting through the storm. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the quiet power of someone who expected to be obeyed. Jack's mind raced. Why was the old man out here, calling to him in the dead of night during a storm? Was this some twisted joke, or had paranoia finally taken hold of the neighborhood recluse? His eyes darted to the street, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might witness the strange scene unfolding. But the street was empty, swallowed by the relentless rain. He felt the pressure of the moment crack him open, and before he could think better of it, he stepped outside. The cold rain hit him like needles, soaking his hair and clothes in an instant. The world around him seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward Mr. Whitaker, each step sinking into the puddle-covered pavement. "Why are you out here?" Jack shouted over the roar of the wind. The old man's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. His eyes narrowed slightly and he tilted his head, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. Then, without warning, he turned and started walking toward his house, his movements fluid despite his age. Jack hesitated but found himself drawn forward, compelled by an invisible thread of fear and curiosity. Before he knew it, he was at Mr. Whitaker's front porch. The door creaked open as the old man stepped inside, leaving it ajar. A faint, flickering light glowed from within, casting long, distorted shadows. Jack's heart thumped wildly as he crossed the threshold, his senses heightened by the unknown. The air inside was damp, with a metallic tang that clung to his nostrils. As the door clicked shut behind him, Jack realized just how quiet it was. The storm outside seemed a world away now, muffled by the thick walls. Mr. Whitaker stood in the center of the room, his back to Jack. In the dim light, Jack noticed something odd, an array of old photographs pinned to the walls, their subjects obscured by age and water damage. Each frame captured the same scene from different angles. People standing on a porch, staring into a dark window, their expressions tense and haunted. "Look closer," Mr. Whitaker's voice came, soft and ghostly, as he turned to face Jack. Jack's gaze shifted to one photograph in particular, and a chill coursed through him. The person in the image was unmistakably himself, taken from behind, standing on his own porch. The realization sent a jolt of panic through Jack's veins. He stumbled back, eyes darting from photo to photo. Each image was of him, each angle capturing moments he'd stood outside or peered out his own window, unaware that he was being watched and documented. "How did you—" Jack's voice trembled, the question incomplete as fear strangled his words. Mr. Whitaker stepped closer, his face unreadable in the shifting light. "I didn't take these," he said, his tone heavy with a somber finality. Jack's mind raced with questions, his breath shallow and uneven. How was this possible? Who had taken these photos? He turned to Mr. Whitaker, who stood unmoving, his eyes glistening like two dark stones in the dim light. The silence between them thickened until it was almost suffocating. Why do you have these?" Jack stammered, his voice breaking. Mr. Whitaker's lips curled into a small, unsettling smile. "They've been watching you, Jack. Just like they watched me before I came here. I've tried to warn you." "Warn me?" Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, to burst out of this suffocating house and into the rain where he could breathe again. But something in Mr. Whitaker's voice pinned him in place as if he were a marionette and the old man was pulling the strings. "They need someone new, Jack. Someone to keep the balance," Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You're their next guardian." "Guardian? Of what?" Jack's voice trembled, teetering between disbelief and fear. Mr. Whitaker stepped closer, his thin fingers trembling as he raised them to point at a door on the far side of the room, half hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. "Open it and you'll see." The room seemed to close in on Jack, every muscle in his body screaming at him not to move. But the pull of the door was too strong, an invisible current dragging him forward. He reached out with a shaking hand and drew the curtain aside, revealing a wooden door, ancient and splintered. As he turned the handle, the door creaked open, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. The darkness inside seemed almost alive, shifting and writhing as though it were breathing. Jack squinted, trying to make out shapes in the gloom, and then he saw them. Eyes. dozens of them, glowing a faint, sickly yellow, watching him from the depths. A chorus of whispers erupted, so close and yet so distant, filling the room with an ancient chant. Jack's legs gave way, and he stumbled backward, colliding with the table and sending a framed photograph crashing to the floor. The noise broke the spell, and Mr. Whitaker's face turned grave. "Now you understand," he said. "They're here for you." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jack's head spun, the sound drilling into his mind like a relentless tide. He looked at Mr. Whitaker, who stood solemn and resigned, his eyes locked onto Jack with a mix of pity and expectation. "You have to take my place, Jack," Whitaker said, his voice cracking as he stepped closer. "The only way to survive is to become one of them." "I don't understand," Jack shouted, his voice trembling as he tried to push the whispers away. Mr. Whitaker's expression softened, his eyes brimming with regret. "You don't need to. Just accept it, or it will consume you." Panic clawed at Jack's chest. The room seemed to ripple, the photographs on the walls blurring and shifting as if alive. He glanced back at the dark room with the glowing eyes, now filled with movement, a writhing mass of shadows that reached for him with spindly, unnatural limbs. Jack's choices flashed before him: run and face the unknown horror that waited outside, or stay and take on the mantle of this twisted guardianship. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but the weight of the gaze from those yellow eyes froze him in place. Suddenly, Mr. Whitaker grabbed Jack's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "There's no time. Choose now." With a shuddering breath, Jack nodded, the decision made before he fully understood it. The moment he agreed, the whispers quieted, and the room settled into an oppressive silence. Mr. Whitaker's hand loosened and he smiled, a sad, hollow smile, as the life seemed to drain from his face. He collapsed to the floor, lifeless, and the shadows retreated back into the dark room. The eyes turned their gaze onto Jack, and he felt an inexplicable bond form, a tether that bound him to this house, this secret, and the malevolent force that had taken over his life. The house was his now, and with it came the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The storm outside began to dissipate, but the quiet that followed was more unsettling than the wind and rain. Jack sat on the old armchair where Mr. Whitaker had once watched the neighborhood, feeling the weight of countless eyes on him. He stared at the photographs on the wall, which now looked different, no longer damaged but vibrant, as if capturing a moment in time that was yet to happen. One photo, placed prominently in the center, showed Jack standing at the window, eyes vacant, watching the street as Mr. Whitaker once did. A low murmur filled the room, and Jack realized it was coming from within him, a voice that whispered promises of power and curses of responsibility. He now understood why Mr. Whitaker had seemed so haunted. The neighborhood, oblivious to the ancient ritual that had just taken place, continued its quiet routine. But now, behind one particular window, a new guardian watched over them with eyes that no longer needed to blink.